Tonight on Nation to Nation, BC introduces legislation to make Truth and Reconciliation Day a provincial holiday.
And it was time, we thought, for British Columbia to follow suit so that all workers in our province would be able to have a day where they could reflect on the history of residential schools.
First Nation leaders are not happy about being left out of Ottawa's bilateral health discussions.
The reality in what's taking place on the ground should be advocated by the nations themselves. The treaty partners should be there.
And an NDP MP has put forward a private member's bill to create an Indigenous national urban park in Windsor, Ontario.
This is actually about returning it to the heritage it had before, and I'm fortunate enough to have the support and the considerations of Caldwell First Nations.
Welcome to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Murray Rankin served as an NDP Member of Parliament from 2012 to 2019 when he left federal politics. In 2020, he was elected to British Columbia's legislature, again under the NDP brand. He now serves in Cabinet as Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, where he's overseen a move to make Truth and Reconciliation Day a statutory holiday in BC. Rankin's work has also included significant land transfers to some First Nations, but there have been some criticisms, especially over how effective the province's UNDRIP legislation has been. Murray Rankin joins us now. Welcome to Nation.
Thanks very much, Fraser.
Now, I guess I'll start with British Columbia introduced a bill just a few days ago on Tuesday to make September 30th a statutory holiday. You called the announcement a long time coming. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, I had the privilege of working with a residential school survivor named Eddie Charlie, who was abused at the Penellicut Residential School on Cooper Island near Victoria, where I live. And I worked with Eddie to introduce into Parliament back in November of 2017, a private member's bill we called Orange Shirt Day that would have made September 30 a national day to commemorate residential school survivors and Truth and Reconciliation progress. And I'm happy to say that the federal government moved, as you know, to create a federal holiday. And it was time, we thought, for British Columbia to follow suit so that all workers in our province would be able to have a day where they could reflect on the history of residential schools and think about how we could move forward better together as a province.
All right, and so you've been in the media quite a bit lately, I guess, and in another recent headline that we noticed, there's an announcement of the transfer of 20,000 hectares of land to the Lake Babine First Nation. What's the purpose of this land transfer?
Ultimately, we want to create, Fraser, a modern arrangement with First Nations in British Columbia. We have some significant treaties under the BC Treaty Commission process, which we hope will be, federal, provincial, and the nation involved, some modern treaties. But we're also trying to do what we call comprehensive reconciliation agreements outside the treaty process. So in this case with Lake Babine, Chief Murphy Abraham and I signed off the land transfer, but there's more to come on the social side and the federal government is contributing as well. So we're hoping to create a number of arrangements on the land in British Columbia to meet the needs of modern First Nations.
Now, some have criticized these foundation agreements like this one as maybe a way to circumvent the BC treaty process, which has faced criticism for being too slow and to result into signed treaties. What do you have to say about that?
I think there's a legitimate criticism about the speed with which we're entering into modern treaties. I'm the first to acknowledge it. It's appalling how long it takes sometimes to do modern treaties. First to acknowledge that. And some First Nations do not wish to constitutionalize the arrangements, which of course is what we do with treaty making. But we want to take our lead from the First Nations. If for them, arrangements outside of treaty are what they want. We are committed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And as you know, we have the first jurisdiction in Canada to enact that as law. Part of the articles include treaties and other land arrangements, of which our comprehensive reconciliations are but one example. We're open to any number of arrangements as we deal with the land issue in a negotiated way outside of the courtroom wherever possible.
Right, and I thought I might ask you about the province's own UNDRIP legislation. As I understand, it's known as DRIPA in the province. What would you say that it has accomplished thus far?
I would have thought there's a number of things it's accomplished. And the most important one is a absolute sea change in the provincial government as to how we work with First Nations and other Indigenous people, Métis and others. There's no question there's been a mind shift, a cultural shift within our system as we work government to government. And I mean, that takes time, Fraser, as you, of course, understand, to change the whole ship of state, if you will, and on a dime. That doesn't happen. But we have an action plan that we co-developed with the First Nation Leadership Council and Métis and Modern Treaty Alliance. And what we've done is we've created 89 specific, tangible, not pie in the sky, but tangible, achievable commitments we've made to work together on. And we're going to have annual reports on this 5-year action plan. We call it the 5-year action plan. Every year, we're going to be held to account as to how well we're doing. Some ministries are going to work well and get it done. Others may have difficulty, but the public, Indigenous peoples will hold us to account, which is exactly what we wanted to do under our DRIPA legislation. So we think it's meaningful and everybody is committed to it. That's the key.
Okay, and I'd like to talk to you about another piece of legislation, which is BC's Mineral Tenure Act. Now, some say that contravenes DRIPA, and Northwest Coast First Nation will be arguing that before BC's Supreme Court in April, that the Act allows anyone to stake a mineral claim without consulting First Nations. What do you think about that?
Well, that statute, as you point out, has been around for a long time, the Mineral Tenure Act, it's called, and it has to do with our history as a mining province going back to before Confederation. Some of your listeners will know about the gold rush, which is so central to the settlers coming to this jurisdiction, of course, occupied by thousands of Indigenous people at the time. It's central to that industry. However, many people think that legislation needs to be reformed. It's one of those things, Fraser, in the action plan. In other words, we acknowledge as a government that has to be addressed. 2 First Nations have taken the province to court. One would hope that we could settle that. It's clearly one of several pieces of historic legislation that we need to review. And our commitment under DRIPA, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, is to what we call align our laws with Indigenous laws. And that's one example of several that we have to do. This is a colonized province. This is a history that goes back before, back to contact in the 18th century, when Captain Vancouver came and Captain Cook came. And since then, we have a colonial history, and we're doing our best to reverse that. And I think the province, and I think it needs to be said that this is not a partisan issue in our legislature. Every member of the legislature that day who came to the legislature voted in favor of DRIPA. I consider this to be all of British Columbia coming together, acknowledging that colonial history and working better toward a future that works for all people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. That is what we're trying to do. Will it be reversed in a couple of sessions of the legislature? Not a chance. But are we on the right course? I am optimistic.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, always so much to talk about, so many issues, but we got through a few, I guess, today. But always a pleasure, Minister Rankin, and thanks for joining us again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Fraser. Thanks for having me.
Up next, we'll have Reg Niganobi, Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation, to talk about this week's bilateral health discussions. Welcome back. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister wrapped up healthcare talks with Canada's 13 premiers. The result is an increase of $196.1 billion over 10 years in health funding. This includes $46.2 billion in new funding, but absent from the negotiating table in Ottawa were First Nations leaders. And this is because they were not invited. Joining us today to talk about this and other healthcare issues affecting First Nations communities is Reg Niganobi. He's the Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation in Northern Ontario. Grand Chief Niganobi, welcome to Nation.
No, thank you for having me.
So as you're aware, the APTN National Chief, Roseanne Archibald, asked the Prime Minister to be part of the healthcare discussions in a letter, and he replied by saying he would be there to advocate on their behalf, I guess. What's your thoughts on the Prime Minister's response?
It's very dismissive and very troubling. We do have our own healthcare issues that I don't know, perhaps he may have heard of in some way, shape, or form, but the reality and what's taking place on the ground should be advocated by the nations themselves. The treaty partners should be there in that discussion.
Right. Okay. And the agreement itself includes $2 billion over 10 years to address what are called unique health challenges Indigenous people face. What's your thoughts on this? Is it anywhere near enough?
Probably not. I mean, we are far behind. Like I mentioned, some of the issues that we have just in accessing healthcare and the infrastructure of healthcare, and then a lot of it is pulled back to the city and the medical service provided in the city, which means we lack a lot of it in the north and some of our areas up this way here within the Anishinaabe Nation. We may be just on the outlying portions of cities or towns or wherever else, but in most instances, it is a far distance to get there, and we do lack the proper access to health, and especially mental health when you want to throw that into the equation too.
Right. Okay. And just moving back to sort of the some of that unhappiness, I guess, that's out there amongst First Nation communities not being part of these healthcare discussions. What do you think the Prime Minister needs to do now to sort of for damage control and maybe make these communities feel a little more part of the ongoing healthcare discussions?
I mean, right now we could be included in the discussions, but I guess that might be at this juncture for this event, could it be a little bit too late? They've probably already decided how that's going to be allocated and the certain things they would like to see within that and that they want, meaning the provinces and everybody else. But of course, First Nations are a second afterthought again, and at this point it would be nice to have a commitment and an agreement, or at least some sort of positive affirmation that will be included going forward on all discussions, not just health.
Okay, and the government wants the provinces and territories to use the money to focus on four critical areas that they said, which include family health, healthcare worker shortages, mental health and substance use, and modernizing the health system. So Liberals want the provinces to share information on how they are meeting these goals as part of, I guess, what the Prime Minister sort of touched on before Christmas about accountability with healthcare funding. What about First Nations? Do you think they should be doing the same thing, providing, sort of progress reports on how they're doing with healthcare dollar spendings to Ottawa, or sort of updates?
Updates wouldn't hurt. I mean, I know some First Nations and some health teams that are Indigenous are collecting that information anyways, for their use, of course, because, it helps inform what sort of care needs are out there. But I think a big issue that we're kind of concerned about here with the Anishinaabe Nation and kind of flagging at this point is the perceived privatization of healthcare. Generally, we know that our people will be at the bottom of the list for that, just because we already have these issues with finding equitable access to, medicine and other services such as that. And like I said, mental health is another big issue that we have on the First Nation that was kind of exacerbated by the pandemic. And that is going to be a big issue going forward. So those are two concerns that we have just in that area.
Okay, maybe I'll touch upon some of the private healthcare funding that clearly the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has said he would like to use, or is moving to use some of this money for private clinics, right, to address what he calls shortages. How do people feel in your area about that? Is that maybe a good way to be going in terms of just addressing shortages or access to healthcare, or would people rather see it just all of that money remain in the public system?
Well, For the Anishinaabe Nation, we promote trilateral partnerships on the provision of healthcare. Ensuring that public access to citizens is maintained as part of our treaty relationship. So whether that be Native or non-Native who's coming in to access services. I find it very troubling that they're making these moves to privatize healthcare. It starts here, but where does it keep going from there? We've seen instances like that before. And like I said, we don't even have the equitable provision to healthcare right now as Anishinaabe people. So we are quite concerned. We can only see that getting worse for us in the long run.
Okay, well, we're going to have to end it there, but thanks once again very much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Chief Niganobi.
Absolutely. Thank you.
After the break, we'll speak to NDP Member of Parliament Brian Massey about his private member's bill, which wants to establish an urban park under First Nations management. Welcome back. Talks are well underway to establish an Indigenous National Urban Park in Windsor, Ontario. The proposed Ojibwe National Urban Park would unite a number of green spaces and consist of a total of 364 hectares. NDP MP Brian Massey has put forward a private member's bill, C-248, to make this proposal a reality. It was debated earlier this week in the House during third reading. Brian Massey joins us today to talk about his bill. So welcome to Nation to Nation, Mr. Massey.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so can you tell our viewers a little bit about the history of this area and why you believe it's so important that it be designated as an Indigenous urban national park?
Well, it's really part of the story of even the War of 1812 and past. And before that, it was part of a trade route and was very significant along the Great Lakes shores and the Detroit River. So it has a great heritage that needs to be protected. Unfortunately, what we did in the area is we logged a lot, like many parts of Canada, brought in agriculture. But because of our Carolinian species and the diversity of our ecosystems, it currently has 200 of Canada's 500 endangered species. And this is one of the last remaining spots along the waterfront that is actually still undeveloped in the area. So for myself and for many others, this is actually about returning it to the heritage it had before. And I'm fortunate enough to have the support and the considerations of Caldwell First Nations, looking at them to be co-managers of the facility as well, too. So this is about, I think an important chapter that needs to be come full circle. And this is what's exciting about the project, is it checks a lot of boxes off for the environment, but also with regards to reconciliation and in our future.
Right, I thought maybe I would ask you about that, like what exact role will Indigenous people or in the area have in actually running this park?
Well, it'll be part of their co-management, and one of the first groups I contacted when we were fighting for part of this is called Ojibwe Shores, which was along the shoreline. The port had that, and I want to remind everyone that ports in Ontario and Canada, they're owned by the public, so it's similar to Canada Post. And so when we were fighting to get this property protected, we brought Caldwell First Nations down to the site, and they didn't have interest in purchasing the site because they're doing their Leamington work as a priority right now, but at the same time they showed direct interest because this is part of their historical areas. And so going forward, if we get the legislation passed and completed, they'll be officially written into the Parks Canada Act as co-managers of the park. So that means that the operations will require consultation, but also restoration, and they're doing that at Point Pelee right now. So some of the history is the past with regards to Point Pelee and Caldwell First Nations, which wasn't good, but is now being restored, and they're part of that actually process now. And then they'll be part of this park from the get-go, and that's one of the things I think is important. So they'll be part of the actual stewards for the future.
Okay, and just from reading some media reports in your area on this, I understand that from what the Liberals are saying, that the government is already kind of working with Parks Canada to establish this park already. So maybe you could tell me why exactly your private member's bill is necessary, or if there's some duplication here?
Yeah, so what's happening is that I actually have amending the Parks Act. So any park that you want to create as a national park in Canada has to actually amend the National Parks Act. So I'm actually going through the full vetted process that's there now, and actually has a highest degree of credibility and accountability for the future. It'll also make sure that the project is done with co-management and it won't be able to be undermined. the Liberals right now, it's almost confusing in the sense of what they have is a draft process. So they don't even know how they're going to finish at the end. So they've started some consultations and they have some working agreements. But what I've done is I've followed the actual legal process right now of doing it, and also enshrining it in the best legislation for all of Canada. And that's why it has support of Caldwell First Nations. That's why it has support of the City of Windsor. It has the support of even unions like Unifor. And others, is because they understand that this is the highest degree of protection and accountability we get. And the government, to their own admission at committee, still is in a draft process, and then they might use mine at the end of the day. So it's rather confusing at the moment, but we're just going to march on with our bill because it's the right way to do things. And we don't want any half measures, especially if Caldwell First Nations is going to be co-managing. They need to be enshrined in legislation that protects them in their agreement, not just a piece of paper that's made up at a government of the day that may also be sunsetted in the future.
Okay, and I don't want to dwell too much on the politics of it, but I did notice that you did have cross-party cooperation, of course, on this because it passed 2 readings. But one of your fellow area Windsor MPs, who's a Liberal, voted against. And did you find, I guess, that was a bit disappointing, or was that just politics at play here, perhaps?
Yeah, it was disappointing because we want to get consensus. In fact, actually, from that vote, we invited the minister and met, and he actually made amendments that went to the committee, and his own Liberal Party actually voted against and turned the amendments down for saying that they were actually out of order. So it's weird what's going on with the Liberal Party right now. I do have a couple other Liberals supporting it, got the Green Party, the Bloc, and the NDP, of course, and the Conservatives. So we're just going to go forward in a positive way, and if somebody wants to improve it and make it better, then we'll be open to that. But I really can't speak about what's going on internally with the Liberals right now. It's rather confusing because having a minister's own amendments turned down by a Liberal chair and then them not even challenging the chair was something I haven't seen in 20 years of representation. But the Liberal Party has to figure that out.
Right, okay. And I guess provided it's gone through 2 readings now and it's coming up on 3rd reading past the committee stage, provided everything does go to plan, how soon do you think this part could actually become a reality?
Oh, it could be really soon. I think it'll enjoy support in the Senate, and we already have this and this is what's really distinct about this part is it's all right now municipal, provincial, and federal land. So there's no private land involved in here. All we're doing is connecting these ecosystems together and providing a proper management solutions. And now with Caldwell First Nations as being identified to be part of the co-managers, we have some of that structure already in place. And then we have eagerness from the City of Windsor and others to move forward. So I mean, this is only time constraint is from Parliament in the process. So I'm hopeful by next year we can actually have it. And I'd love to see this happen when the Gordie Howe Bridge, which is next to this international border crossing that's being built, is going to open in a couple of years, that we open both of them around the same time. And that could be wonderful because they're just basically putting the stuff together. That's all the ingredients are there. Just have to put the process in place.
Great. Well, we're going to have to end it there, but thanks very much again for joining us today, Mr. Massey.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And that wraps up this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. Thanks for joining us, and good night.